So, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the, I think, most important part of this afternoon. We have our guest, Michaela Shellenberger. He has heard the introductory words by our president, and he is going to explain to us now how far the DSA can be a threat to the freedom of speech. Michael, it's up to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you very much, Member of European Parliament Kartheiser. It's been fantastic to get to know you the last couple of days. Thank you, Mr. Procaccini, for your wonderful remarks. It's a great pleasure to be here. We Americans care very much for Europe, not simply as tourists, though we certainly do enjoy that, but we do feel a continuing friendship and brotherhood with all of the European peoples, and we feel a continuing responsibility for what happens here, not just in terms of security, but in all manner. And even though you have seen our own politics shift more towards a national perspective, I think the majority of Americans want to maintain our strong bond, which has existed for nearly 80 years now. All of that being said, every relationship requires appropriate boundaries. And so I came here to say something very simple about free speech and the relationship between the DSA and the United States of America. And this is in particular directed at Ursula von der Leyen. And my message is in two words: back off. Back off your attacks on freedom of speech. Back off your attacks on the extraterritorial ambitions of the DSA, which are written right there in the statute. Now, you might think I'm being oversensitive on this matter. After all, Americans are very sensitive on issues of free speech. You may know that the founders of our country did not want a constitution. They didn't want a United States of America if we didn't have free speech enshrined as the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights to our Constitution. So yes, we are sensitive to this issue. And I think we have justification to be sensitive to it. The former head of the DSA enforcement, former Commissioner Thierry Breton, before Elon Musk did an interview with a presidential candidate by the name of Donald Trump, sent a letter warning Elon Musk that he might be in violation of European law. It's hard to describe how annoying we Americans found that letter to be. We don't care for foreigners telling us who we can and cannot speak with. And we don't care, and it's not an issue of Republican, Democrat. I myself am an independent. I didn't vote for a presidential candidate. I'm a working journalist. I have old-fashioned views of objectivity. But suffice it to say, on this issue in particular, every journalist should be a free speech activist in the world, and we did not take kindly to that assault on our First Amendment, that attempted assault. And you may remember that Elon Musk, who also was unhappy about this, posted a rather impolite meme, I think he even said himself. I won't repeat it in polite company, but needless to say, this rubbed us the wrong way, and we were happy to see Mr. Breton's early retirement from the Commission after this incident. It gave us some hope. The problem of disinformation and misinformation and malinformation, it's a real problem. I've dedicated my life to combating misinformation. This is why I have 2 published books, each of which have 1,200 endnotes with references to the best available information. This is why I go on X and always start by repeating what the conventional wisdom is on a particular issue. And then I proceed to debunk it. I explain why it's wrong. It has never occurred to me to demand that the people that I criticize be censored. That is a completely foreign and bizarre idea to me. Life wouldn't be worth living if I didn't have people to disagree with. What would it be like to agree with everybody? It's a nightmare. You watch a Black Mirror episode about that. You could read 1984, which apparently some members of the European Commission view not as a work of fiction, but as a handbook for implementing the DSA. Misinformation and disinformation and malinformation are serious problems. That's why we have freedom of speech. That's why we have journalism. That's why we allow people to argue. That's why we support discourse and debate. Censorship can never be a solution to misinformation. How could it be? You're simply allowing the misinformation to exist, and then you're hiding it, and then you're repressing the conversation about the topic at hand. Nobody knows more about any issue in the world than the issues that we have debate over, the issues that we have debates over facts on. Now, you have a fair objection. What about when people lie in order to steal your money? That's fraud. What about when people deliberately lie to destroy your reputation and ruin your career in life? That's defamation. What about when people exploit children, child exploitation? There's no disagreement that these cases are illegal, already illegal, should be illegal, should remain to be illegal, and every social media platform has a legal obligation and a moral obligation to fight these forms of freedom, these forms of speech. There's no disagreement about that. No additional laws are required to do that. The only question here is, are we going to allow a small committee of trusted flaggers, which, by the way, consist almost entirely of people in their 20s who are simply looking to see what the mainstream newspapers say is the truth, and then censoring on the basis of that? How has that worked out for us over the last several years? Let's just take a look. We were informed by every major government in the world and every mainstream news media organization that once you took the COVID vaccine, you would not be infected. You would not transmit the infection to anybody else once you had the vaccine. That was promised by every major government in the world, every major news media outlet. Was there ever a justification to make that claim? There was zero justification for that claim. They did not know that that would be the case. They had no basis for claiming it. Therefore, it was disinformation. And it was spread widely, and I didn't see anybody in the European Union demand that the people said that be censored or punished for saying it. What about where the COVID virus came from? We were informed that it came from a wet market in China. And when a U.S. senator suggested that maybe it had something to do with the gain-of-function research that the U.S. government had secretly moved to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Washington Post referred to that as a debunked conspiracy theory. Anybody that has access to this little tool known as Google search engine could have searched for virus leaking from a lab, and you would have discovered hundreds of articles around the world over the last decade about viruses leaking from labs. It turns out that it's quite common for viruses to leak from labs. The idea that that's a conspiracy theory is an example of what Freud and Jung would call psychological projection. The conspiracy theory might have been that it came from a wet market in China. The majority of U.S. intelligence agencies at this point believe that that virus leaked from a lab, and we were proud to be the first news media organization to name the first 3 patient zero who got the coronavirus, and they were the people working to manipulate the coronavirus. That was mis- or disinformation, depending on your point of view. Anthony Fauci knew exactly what the Wuhan Institute of Virology was doing because it was him who skirted U.S. law. After arguing that we should do gain-of-function research in the United States, he skirted the law and moved that research to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And now we're about to get the files to find out exactly what happened with that little piece of disinformation. What about the Hunter Biden laptop? This was, we were told that this was a Russian information operation by 51 former intelligence heads, including former heads of the CIA. That was proposed as the justification to censor a New York Post article little less than a month before the 2020 elections. We also discovered through the Twitter files that there was an active effort by the Aspen Institute on behalf of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to brainwash the mainstream media journalists through 2 separate workshops in the summer and fall of 2020, as well as to directly go to Facebook and Twitter and say that they had intelligence that there was a secret Russian plan to spread disinformation about Hunter Biden and Burisma involving an influence operation of the whole Biden family. That was the conspiracy theory that they persuaded the entire news media and social media of as well. The CIA approved that letter from the 51 intelligence agents. It was all disinformation. The laptop was in the hands of the FBI in December 2019. The FBI's Laura Demlow, the head of the Foreign Influence Task Force, admitted in her transcribed testimony to Congress that they knew that the laptop was in the hands of the FBI, and they knew within hours that the laptop was legitimate, and it showed exactly what it appeared to be on the laptop, which was a vast influence operation influence peddling scheme of selling access to then Vice President Joe Biden through his son and his brother-in-law. That was a disinformation campaign that became the basis for demanding censorship. And so you might detect a pattern here. My objection is not simply to government censorship. My objection is to the weaponization of our intelligence and security agencies to make claims that they know to be false to achieve a political agenda, and then to demand censorship on the basis of that disinformation. And now you might think, good thing that's all behind us, good thing that no one's doing that anymore, except for the fact that you open up the newspaper today and you discover that the European Commission is accusing TikTok and the Russians of engaging in a disinformation effort to elect a right-wing Romanian as president. Simple question, where's the evidence of this? Has anybody produced the evidence? I'd like to see the papers on this. I'd like to see the evidence for it. We don't trust our intelligence and security agencies, and that itself is a national security threat. When you can't trust your own intelligence and security agencies to protect you and not engage in weaponization and not engage in politicization, you have a big problem as a civilization. And I don't trust them for very good reasons. We uncovered another disinformation and censorship operation earlier this year in late May, early June. Ursula von der Leyen herself involved in claiming that the right-wing politicians in Germany were accepting money from the Russian government and that it was through a Voice of Europe website that really nobody had heard of. Everybody that claimed that they claimed had taken money denied it. The intelligence agencies of Poland, Czech Republic, and Germany all claimed that they had the information. Where was the information? Why couldn't we see it? Why have we still not seen it? Why has that story disappeared from the news media? Why did it only happen to come out a couple of weeks before the election as Europeans were deciding who they were going to vote for the European Parliament? They're openly engaged in the politicization and weaponization of our intelligence and security agencies every day in this building. They're doing this. And so it is my pleasure to denounce this weaponization here, just as I have in the US Congress, where we're about to open up the files of the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, all of which were politicized and weaponized against their political opponents. And I say this not as a right-wing populist or somebody, a Eurosceptic, actually quite liberal on very many issues, support the EU. I think it's a very efficient and beautiful peacemaking organization. But nonetheless, the people that created our liberal democracies fought and died for free speech. They fought and died so that the kings were not allowed to just arbitrarily murder the people in their countries. And you had a different history than we had. Your history was years and years, decades and decades, centuries and centuries of petitioning the king and asking for the right to be able to say certain things. Our country had a different founding. We said we want First Amendment at the top because free speech comes before democracy. So when we hear Ursula von der Leyen talk about how you have a democracy shield, to shield democracy from freedom of speech, to shield democracy from speech, that's right out of 1984. Democracy shield, Ministry of Truth. This is absurd that it's gotten as far as it's gotten. Now, I share your concern about the DSA. I think there's provisions in it around privacy. You know, the Europeans actually are much closer to me on privacy issues. Americans don't care enough about privacy. We experience the Europeans as not caring enough about free speech. There's certainly things in there that need to be rescued. But the idea of creating committees of so-called experts to decide what's true and false in advance, and then fine the social media platforms if they don't do what those bureaucrats say, should offend all of us as free citizens. That's the difference between being a slave or a serf and being a free citizen. It's that we have the right to speak our mind, and we constitute our governments, our leaders, on the basis of that speech. They don't give us the right to speak. We give them the right to govern. So the solution to freedom of speech is the solution to misinformation is more speech. It's not censorship. We have seen something happening around the world. Ostensibly, it's all a giant coincidence that Brazil and Canada and Ireland and the EU and the United States, they all at the same time came up with the same idea around 2016, that we needed to get in control of the social media platforms. It's also a magical coincidence that they all had the same plan to go and create government-funded NGOs, which, by the way, is a contradiction in term, government-funded organizations to decide what was true or false. That's your ministry of truth. That they were then going to go to the social media platforms and ask them to take down things until they got the legal power to punish them and fine them. This all clearly emerged as a plan that came out of the war on terror. These tactics were first developed in the Arab Spring and then in Eastern Europe. This is known as hybrid warfare. And then those tactics were turned against our people after 2016. After the populist revolutions of Brexit and the election of Trump, clearly decisions were made that certain people that felt that they ran the world felt that they had lost control of the social media platforms and they needed to regain that control. And I should hasten to say that independent political experts in the United States do not ascribe Trump's victory to social media. Most ascribe it to him defeating his Republican opponents in the primary and then defeating Hillary Clinton through the mainstream news media. But nonetheless, the sense was in the intelligence and security agencies that they had lost control of the ability to set the agendas, to define the frame of the debate, what we call the Overton window of the debate, and they needed to regain control of it. And we're all downstream from that decision almost 8 years later. That was made deep within the darkest, worst parts of our government, apparently, deciding that they needed to get control. And we've seen it everywhere. In Ireland, there was legislation that would have allowed the police to go into people's homes and read their telephones and their computers, searching for misinformation and hate speech. I mean, it sounds like a Black Mirror episode. Why Ireland, by the way? What a funny coincidence. Why Ireland? It's a small country. Does it really matter? Is it a coincidence that Ireland is the headquarters of every major social media and internet company? Is that possibly one of the reasons that you could go into the homes of the executives of those companies and seize their phones and computers? Maybe. What about Brazil? Why do they have the exact same situation in Brazil? Trusted flaggers, government censorship, a slight difference in that this was all overseen in the judiciary branch rather than the executive branch, but it was the exact same setup for the censorship industrial complex. Are people so gullible? Are we really so gullible? You know, the idea here is that somebody says something wrong online and that everybody will suddenly believe it. Somebody says, the earth is flat, and then suddenly everybody believes it. Or as our Supreme Court Justice said during a recent hearing, she said, what if kids see people jumping out of buildings? Obviously, they'll all jump out of buildings because we all do exactly what we see online. I found this slightly humorous because it so happens that I love to follow accounts of people jumping out of buildings. It's known as parkour. You might have heard of it. It's a wonderful thing. I've never considered jumping out of buildings because I see people jumping out of buildings. In fact, I look at it and I go, I'm never going to jump out of a building. It turns out that there is a lot of social science on this question of how gullible are people. There's a book called by a Princeton scholar, Hugo Mercier, where he goes through all the research. And what he discovers, and this is lots of experiments in terms of how do you persuade people to change their mind. And what they find over and over again is that people are really stubborn. They're more stubborn than they are open-minded. You may be familiar with this as people involved in politics, how hard it is to change people's minds. It's very hard, right? It takes a huge amount of effort. In fact, you're always only getting a few percentage points, a few people to switch their votes. So it's very hard to change their minds. So this idea that everybody's so gullible or somebody sees something wrong, the whole point of social media is that you can reply. Now on X they have community notes, but you don't need community notes. You can reply. And you may know that on X, the kids call it being ratioed. When you've said something nobody likes, there's more replies than there are reposts. That's called being ratioed. That's the beauty of freedom of speech at work. Say something wrong or stupid on X, and you'll be ratioed. And maybe you'll turn out to be right, and time will tell. People thought Galileo and Copernicus were wrong. Turned out to be right. They would have been ratioed in their day. But nonetheless, we already have a built-in mechanism within free speech to correct misinformation. What about hate speech? There's all this hate speech online. Oh, it's terrible, all this hate speech online. And obviously it leads to real-world violence, right? Well, except does it? We did a comprehensive review of the literature on hate speech. I'm old enough to remember when violent video games were going to cause young men to go out there and beat people up. I remember violent movies were supposed to do that. None of the research ever panned out, showing any link between what people see on media and what they do offline. What about hatred in general? Can we remove hatred from the human heart? Is that possible? Can we get rid of hatred? Maybe if we repress it, if we hide hatred from people, there won't be hatred. This is an ancient emotion, hatred. It's evolved with us for a reason. The idea that hatred is something that needs to be censored is absurd. It needs to be countered. Ask Daryl Davis, African-American in the United States, himself has converted Ku Klux Klan members in the United States. Ku Klux Klan, those are our Nazis, our domestic-grown Nazis. Daryl Davis has done that, and he's the biggest advocate. I see you guys have me right here. I love it. Should I duck or? Are you not able to film? Yeah. Okay.
There's no way.
Oh, was that the whole speech like that? Wow. Ursula von der Leyen, what a message. He's the biggest advocate for freedom of speech. Why? Because you cannot counter hate through censorship. It's the same problem with misinformation. The only way you can counter hate is with love, and the only way you can express that love is if the hate is allowed to stand online and you can speak back to it. Now, we do carve out an exception to this. It's called the immediate incitement to violence, and it's a moment when speech turns into action. So you might say, I hate all the migrants in my country. I wish they would all go away. I wish they would all die. That's awful. It's terrible. It should be allowed so that you can talk back to it. You can address the hatred. When you say, everybody should assemble in front of this hotel of migrants and then now burn it down, that clearly crosses the line. This is the line that most governments in the world have. Now, I will acknowledge that the European governments are going to draw that line a little bit closer to just incitement and not to the immediate side, so there's some differences here between the United States and Europe. But nonetheless, it's that immediacy, it's the ways in which the words would turn into an action. That's what we need to be concerned about and control. But just general expressions of hatred, that's every major civil rights movement in human history, every movement for human liberation, for racial minorities, for sexual minorities, has demanded free speech, had been denied freedom of speech, and in fact had to get freedom of speech first before they could make the case for their movements of liberation. There is no time in history when the good guys are the censors. 0 instances when the good guys are censors. Never happened. That's why the true champions of love and rights, like Daryl Davis, are the biggest advocates of freedom of speech. So where does that leave us? I think back to there's a beautiful Cambridge history of the printing press. We all know the Gutenberg movable type. It was an innovation with the kind of type, the metal type that they used, and they combined a set of technologies to get the Gutenberg printing press, which then allowed the Gutenberg Bible. The Catholic Church, they loved the printing press at first. The Catholic Church loved it. They could print the Bibles very cheaply and rapidly. And then this guy named Martin Luther got a hold of it and printed his famous denunciation of the indulgements that the Catholic Church would be selling to forgive people of sin. And then suddenly the printing press was being chased all over Europe. And the Dutch hid the printing press underground, and they had to ship pamphlets all over. Twitter, before Elon Musk take over, was the printing press when it was controlled by the Catholic Church. It was so tightly regulated. We got in there and we saw that there was actually something called a blacklist. Now, as a journalist, of course, we were thrilled because that's a great story, that there's actually blacklists in Twitter. But as a citizen, a free citizen that believes in free speech, we were horrified by this. On the list was Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the world's great epidemiologists, professor at Stanford. He had authored the Great Barrington Declaration that was published in the fall of 2020, along with Martin Kulldorff of Harvard and Sunita Gupta of Cambridge. And it argued that we should protect the vulnerable from COVID, but we should allow the schools to remain open, the society to remain open. And he was on the Trends blacklist. Why? Did he spread misinformation? No, he countered misinformation. He was on the Trends blacklist because that's what Twitter, which was aligned with the US government, aligned with the public health establishment, they believed that simply having him on Twitter suggesting that the lockdowns were a bad idea constituted a form of misinformation. This, in a crisis like COVID, is the time that you most need freedom of speech. What we've seen around the world is governments increasingly using this crisis after that crisis to demand a crackdown. We can't figure out what to do in the face of a fast-changing problem like COVID without freedom of speech. And I'm happy to say that after we discovered that, obviously Elon Musk got him off the blacklist, invited him over to X, and now President-elect Donald Trump has nominated Jay Bhattacharya to be the head of our National Institute of Health, which is sweet justice and revenge on his mistreatment as a scholar. But I also think tells us something else, which is that so often the people throughout history that have been censored the most are precisely the people that had discovered a new truth and had the courage to tell a new truth. And I think we're going to discover that that same thing is happening here in the European Union, and it's precisely what we need to guard against. Thank you very much.